He thought she was just a waitress cleaning the floor, but that night, something unseen would stop the most powerful man in the room in his tracks. The restaurant was supposed to be silent by then, the kind of silence that settles after midnight when the last glass has been cleared and the last wealthy guest has stepped into a waiting car under soft golden lights, but down on the polished marble floor, Lena Brooks moved as if the night still belonged to her, her worn sneakers gliding quietly over the damp surface as she pushed the mop in slow, steady circles, the faint scent of lemon cleaner rising into the air, mixing with the ghost of expensive wine and perfume. And for a moment, she paused, her shoulders lifting with a quiet breath as if she was listening to something no one else could hear, because there was no music playing, no speakers humming, no rhythm in the room except the distant hum of city traffic miles below, yet she closed her eyes, just for a second, and then she stepped forward, light, careful, and began to move, not like someone performing, not like someone trying to impress, but like someone remembering, her arms lifting slightly, her body swaying in a rhythm that didn't exist in the air but lived somewhere deeper, somewhere older, her movements imperfect but honest, each step carrying a weight that couldn't be seen but could somehow be felt, and above her, hidden behind a dark glass balcony reserved for those who never needed to be seen, Adrian Volkov stood completely still, one hand resting lightly against the railing, his expression unreadable as his sharp eyes followed the figure below, because he hadn't come here for this, he hadn't planned to stay. His night had been scheduled down to the minute, meetings, decisions, numbers that shaped entire districts of the city, yet something about the way she moved had interrupted that rhythm, not loudly, not dramatically, but enough to make him stop mid-step, and for a man like Adrian, stopping was not something that happened easily, his world didn't allow for pauses, didn't allow for distractions, and yet there he was, watching a girl in a faded uniform dance alone with a mop in her hands, his brow tightening slightly as if trying to place something just out of reach, because there was a pattern to her movement, a familiarity that pressed faintly against his memory, like a melody half forgotten, and behind him, one of his men shifted, uncomfortable with the silence, his voice low as he leaned in slightly, asking if he should have her removed, because employees weren't supposed to behave like that, not in a place like this, not under the ownership of a man like Adrian Volkov, but Adrian didn't answer right away, his gaze never leaving her, his fingers curling slowly against the railing as she turned, her face catching a sliver of light for just a second, enough to reveal something fragile, something human, something that didn't belong to the world he controlled, and when she spun lightly, almost losing her balance before catching herself with a quiet laugh no one could hear, something shifted, subtle but undeniable, inside him, the kind of shift that didn't announce itself, didn't ask permission, it simply existed. And for the first time that night, Adrian spoke, his voice low, controlled, but carrying a weight that made the room behind him freeze, "Bring her to me." The music stopped the moment the elevator doors opened, not because anyone had turned it off, but because Lena Brooks had realized too late that she was no longer alone, her hands tightening instinctively around the handle of the mop as two men in dark suits approached her with a quiet authority that did not need explanation, their shoes echoing softly against the polished floor that she had just finished cleaning, and for a brief second she thought about apologizing, about explaining that she had only been trying to pass the time, that the shift had been long and the silence heavier than usual, but the words never made it to her lips because one of the men simply said her name, not loudly, not harshly, just precisely, as if it had already been confirmed somewhere far above her pay grade, Lena Brooks, and something about the way he said it made her chest tighten, because people like him did not guess, they knew. And knowing meant this was not a misunderstanding, it was a decision. And decisions like this never came from someone standing at her level, her eyes flickering briefly toward the staircase that led to the upper floor, toward the private section she had only ever heard about in whispers among the staff, where deals were made and conversations happened that never reached the rest of the building, and suddenly the memory of her own laughter just moments ago felt misplaced, almost dangerous. Like she had stepped outside the invisible line she had always been careful not to cross. "You need to come with us," the second man said, his tone neutral, leaving no room for refusal but offering no threat either, and that was somehow worse, because it meant this was routine for them, this quiet removal, this silent correction. Lena swallowed, nodding quickly as she set the mop aside, wiping her damp hands against her apron in a small, nervous motion that betrayed more than she intended. her heart beginning to beat faster with every step as they guided her toward the elevator, the soft hum of its ascent filling the silence that none of them seemed interested in breaking, and she kept her gaze lowered, not out of obedience but out of instinct, because she had learned quickly in places like this that attention was something you survived by avoiding, not seeking, yet tonight something had drawn attention to her anyway, something she could not undo, and when the elevator doors opened again, the air felt different, heavier, quieter in a way that made every small sound feel amplified, the hallway lined with dark wood and low lighting that cast long shadows across the floor, and at the end of it, a set of double doors stood slightly open, a thin line of light cutting through the darkness like a warning she did not know how to read. One of the men stepped forward, pushing the door wider without knocking, as if permission had already been granted long before they arrived, and then they stepped aside, not forcing her, not rushing her, just waiting, and Lena hesitated for the briefest moment, her breath catching as she realized that whatever was waiting on the other side of that door had been the one watching her all along, the one who had seen something in a moment she thought belonged only to herself, and now there was no turning back, her fingers tightening slightly at her sides as she took a step forward, crossing the threshold into a room that felt too still, too controlled, and there, standing near the window with the city lights stretching endlessly behind him, Adrian Volkov did not move, did not speak, he simply watched her, the same way he had before. Only now there was no distance left between them, and for the first time that night, Lena understood that this was not about what she had done, it was about what he had seen, and that realization settled in the room like a silence neither of them could break. Adrian did not speak immediately, and that silence stretched just long enough to make Lena painfully aware of every small detail she wished she could hide, the faint dampness at the edge of her sleeves, the scuffed soles of her shoes, the way her hands instinctively folded together in front of her as if she could make herself smaller by doing so, but it was not the kind of silence filled with anger or impatience, it was something else, something heavier, as though he was searching for a reason that refused to present itself clearly, his gaze steady, unblinking, not drifting over her like others often did but resting with a precision that made it impossible to ignore, and when he finally moved, it was subtle, a slight shift of his posture as he stepped away from the window, the city lights falling behind him as he entered the dim glow of the room. "Look at me," he said, his voice calm, not raised, not sharp, but carrying an authority that did not require repetition, and Lena hesitated for a fraction of a second before lifting her eyes, her breath catching as their gazes met fully for the first time, because up close, he did not look like the stories the staff whispered about, he looked composed, controlled, almost distant, but there was something beneath that surface, something unsettled that she could not quite define, and for a moment neither of them spoke again, the quiet pressing in around them like a weight neither had expected to carry. "Why were you dancing?" he asked. Not accusing, not curious in the way people ask casual questions, but deliberate, as though the answer mattered in a way he did not fully understand, and Lena blinked, caught off guard not by the question itself but by the way it was asked, because she had expected something else, a warning, a reprimand, a reminder of rules she had broken without realizing, but not this, not a question that reached into something personal, something she had never needed to explain before, her lips parting slightly before she spoke, her voice soft but steady despite the tension in her chest. "I did not think anyone was watching," she said, and the words hung in the air between them, simple, honest, but not quite an answer. Adrian's expression did not change, but something in his eyes shifted, a subtle narrowing as if that response had only deepened the question rather than resolved it. "That is not what I asked," he said quietly, and this time there was a trace of something firmer beneath the calm, not anger, but insistence. And Lena swallowed, her fingers tightening slightly as she searched for a way to explain something that had never required explanation before, her gaze dropping for a brief moment before lifting again, because avoiding his eyes felt more dangerous than meeting them now. "I dance because it is the only time I do not feel tired," she admitted, the last word softer, almost reluctant, as if it carried more meaning than she wanted to reveal, and for the first time since she had entered the room. Adrian's composure faltered, not visibly to anyone else, but enough for the air to change, enough for the distance between them to feel different, because tired was not a word he expected, not in that way, not delivered without complaint or self-pity, just stated as a fact, and something about that simplicity struck deeper than any elaborate explanation could have. His gaze lingering on her a moment longer before shifting slightly, not away from her, but inward, as if the answer had unlocked something he had not been prepared to face, and when he spoke again, his voice was quieter, less controlled. There was no music, he said, almost to himself, and Lena's lips curved faintly, not quite a smile. More like a memory brushing against the surface. There was, she replied softly, just not out loud, and the room fell still again, but this time it was not the same silence as before. It was heavier, more fragile, as though something invisible had been placed between them, something neither of them could yet name, but both could feel, and for the first time that night, Adrian did not have an immediate response. He simply stood there, looking at her as if she had said something far more significant than the words themselves, and in that quiet moment, the balance in the room shifted in a way neither of them could undo. Adrian remained still for a moment longer, as if the air itself had thickened around him, his mind catching on her words in a way he could not easily dismiss, because in his world everything had a source, a signal, a cause that could be traced and controlled, yet what she described did not belong to any system he understood. It was something internal, something that existed without permission, and that unsettled him more than he cared to admit, his gaze returning to her with a sharper focus. Not harsher, but more intent, as if he was no longer just observing her but trying to understand the space she seemed to carry within herself. What kind of music? He asked, and this time the question came slower, more measured, like he was stepping carefully into unfamiliar ground, and Lena exhaled softly, the tension in her shoulders easing just slightly as if the question itself allowed her to stand more firmly in her own truth, her eyes drifting for a brief second toward the window behind him where the city lights stretched endlessly, blinking in quiet rhythm, the kind you remember, she said, her voice calm, almost reflective, and for a moment it sounded less like an answer to him and more like something she had told herself many times before. Adrian's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, because memory was not something he allowed himself to linger in. It was inefficient, unpredictable, and often inconvenient, yet something about the way she said it made it feel less like weakness and more like survival, and that distinction held his attention, his fingers flexing slightly at his side as if grounding himself in the present. And what do you remember? He asked, and this time there was no edge in his tone, only a quiet insistence that carried more weight than any command, and Lena hesitated, not out of fear but because the answer did not belong in a room like this, not under soft lights and polished floors and a man who controlled outcomes with precision, but she did not look away, because something in his expression told her that silence would not protect her here, not in the way it usually did. My father, she said simply, and the room seemed to absorb the words before releasing them back into the quiet, Adrian's eyes narrowing slightly, not in suspicion but in recognition of the shift, because that answer changed the question entirely. He used to play music when we did not have anything else, she continued, her voice steady, not fragile, not breaking, just honest, not on a radio, not on anything you could see, just tapping on the table, humming under his breath, making something out of nothing so the room did not feel empty. And as she spoke, the polished walls around them felt less imposing, as if her words carried a different kind of weight, one that did not rely on status or power but on something far more difficult to measure. Adrian's gaze did not leave her, but something in it softened, not visibly, not in a way anyone else would notice, but enough to change the silence between them, because for the first time that night, he was no longer trying to identify her, he was trying to understand her, and that was a shift he had not anticipated. And tonight, he said quietly, you were not cleaning, and Lena shook her head slightly, a faint breath escaping her as if the correction mattered more than it seemed. No, she replied, I was just trying to make the room feel less empty. And that was the moment something in Adrian stilled completely, not his body, but the part of him that measured value in control and outcome, because emptiness was not something he had ever tried to fill, it was something he had learned to ignore, to move past, to outwork, and yet standing there in that carefully constructed room, he realized that for all its perfection, for all its silence and order, it had never felt full, and the realization did not come with force or clarity, it came quietly, settling in the space between them like something that had always been there waiting to be seen. And for the first time in a long time, Adrian did not issue a command, he did not dismiss her, he did not turn away, he simply stood there, looking at her as if she had revealed something he had spent years avoiding. And the room remained silent, but it was no longer empty. Adrian exhaled slowly, though it was subtle enough that most people would not have noticed it, but in a room this quiet even the smallest shift carried weight, his gaze drifting briefly past Lena toward the city beyond the glass as if measuring something far larger than the moment itself, because what she had said did not belong to the world he controlled, it did not fit into any structure he had built, and yet it lingered, pressing against his thoughts in a way that refused to be dismissed. "You stayed late," he said after a moment, his voice returning to something more neutral, though not as distant as before, and Lena nodded slightly, her posture still careful but no longer shrinking, as if standing in front of him had forced her into a kind of honesty she could not retreat from. "They needed the floors done before morning," she replied, her tone simple, factual, the way someone speaks when they are used to being overlooked, and Adrian studied her for a second longer, taking in the small details he would have ignored any other night, the faint crease at the edge of her sleeve, the way her hands rested still now instead of fidgeting, the quiet steadiness in her voice, and something about it felt deliberate, not practiced, but chosen, as if she had learned how to exist without asking for space, and that realization sat with him longer than expected. "And you always dance?" he asked. And this time it was not really a question, more like he was confirming something he had already begun to understand, and Lena hesitated, just slightly, before answering, "Only when no one is supposed to be watching," she said, and there was no embarrassment in her tone, no apology, just a quiet boundary, and Adrian's eyes held hers for a moment longer, as if that answer mattered more than it should, because in his world everything happened in front of someone, observed, recorded, controlled, but the idea of something existing purely for itself, without audience or approval, felt unfamiliar in a way that unsettled him. His fingers tapping once against the edge of the table before going still again. "You said your father," he continued, his voice lower now, not probing, but following a thread he could not ignore, and Lena nodded again, her gaze softening just slightly, not with sadness, but with something steadier. "He worked nights too," she said, "construction, long hours, came home tired, but he never let the house feel quiet, not like that kind of quiet that makes everything feel empty," she added, and Adrian's jaw tightened faintly, because the way she described it felt less like a memory and more like a standard, something she carried forward without even realizing it. "He taught you that," Adrian said, and Lena shook her head gently, a faint breath escaping her. "No, he showed me," she corrected, and that distinction landed heavier than expected, because showing required presence, consistency, something that could not be forced or commanded, and Adrian found himself looking at her differently again, not as someone beneath him, not even as someone separate from his world, but as someone who carried something he did not, something that could not be bought or arranged or secured, and the silence returned, but this time it was not uncertain, it was reflective, stretching just long enough for the weight of the conversation to settle, and when Adrian finally spoke again, his voice was quieter than before, almost thoughtful. "No one has ever tried to make this place feel full," he said, more to himself than to her. And Lena glanced around the room for a brief moment, taking in the polished surfaces, the perfect arrangement of everything, and then she looked back at him, her expression calm, grounded. "Maybe they thought it already was," she replied, and that was when something in Adrian shifted in a way he could not ignore, because for the first time, he saw the difference between something that looked complete and something that actually felt alive, and the realization did not come with discomfort, it came with clarity, quiet and undeniable, and he stood there, no longer measuring the moment, no longer controlling it, just present in it, as the room held a silence that was no longer empty but waiting. Adrian did not respond right away, and that silence felt different now, not heavy with authority but weighted with something closer to thought, as if he was standing at the edge of a realization he had not planned to reach, his eyes drifting once more across the room, taking in the polished wood, the carefully placed glassware, the soft lighting that had always been designed to impress, and for the first time he saw it not as complete but as still, too still, like something preserved rather than lived in, and that distinction lingered longer than he expected. "What time do you leave?" he asked finally, his voice steady but quieter than before, and Lena blinked slightly at the shift, her shoulders easing just a fraction as the question moved away from the weight of everything they had just uncovered. "Around 1 in the morning, she answered, her tone calm, though her eyes briefly flickered toward the door as if reminding herself where she was. "Sometimes later if they need extra work done," she added, and Adrian nodded once, not as acknowledgement of her schedule but as if filing away something more subtle, something about the way she said it without complaint, without expectation, and that absence of expectation stood out to him in a way he could not ignore, because in his world everything was negotiated, everything came with terms, yet she spoke as if effort simply existed on its own, without transaction, and that difference settled quietly between them, and after that, he continued, his gaze returning to her with the same steady focus, "You go home," and it was a simple statement, but there was something beneath it, something that made Lena pause for a brief second before answering, not out of hesitation but because the truth did not need embellishment. "Yes," she said, "I go home," and Adrian watched her for a moment longer, as if waiting for more, but she did not offer anything else, no explanation, no details, just the simplicity of her answer, and that simplicity carried more weight than any elaborate story could have, because it left space, and space was something he was not used to, his fingers resting lightly against the edge of the table before he straightened slightly, a subtle shift that seemed to bring the room back into focus. "Tomorrow," he said, and the word came with quiet clarity, "you will not be assigned to the floor," and Lena's eyes widened just slightly, the first visible crack in her composure since she had entered the room, not fear this time, but uncertainty, because this was not the outcome she had prepared for. "Sir," she began carefully, her voice respectful but steady, "if I did something wrong, I can fix it," and Adrian shook his head once, not sharply, just enough to stop the thought before it formed further. "This is not a correction," he said, and there was no edge in his tone, only certainty. "It is a change," and the distinction hung in the air, unfamiliar and difficult to place. Lena remained still, her hands folding again lightly in front of her, not in submission but in grounding, as she tried to understand what he meant without asking, because asking felt like crossing another line she could not see. And Adrian studied her for a moment longer, as if recognizing that unspoken hesitation. "You will assist with the upstairs rooms," he added, his voice measured, "areas that require attention, not just maintenance," and the phrasing was deliberate, though even he might not have fully realized why, and Lena nodded slowly, not because she fully understood but because she understood enough to know this was not something she could refuse, and for a brief moment neither of them spoke again, the shift settling into place quietly, and as Adrian turned slightly, his gaze moving once more toward the window, the city stretching endlessly beyond, he spoke again, almost as if finishing a thought that had only just begun to form. "Some rooms should not feel empty," he said. And this time it was not a command, not even a question, just a statement that lingered in the air between them, and Lena did not respond right away, but the faintest nod followed, subtle but certain, as if she understood something he had not fully said, and in that quiet exchange, something had changed, not loudly, not dramatically, but enough that the room itself felt different, as if it had finally begun to breathe. The hallway felt longer on the way out, not because the distance had changed but because something inside Lena had, her steps quieter now, more deliberate as she followed the same two men back toward the elevator, though this time they did not walk ahead of her, they moved slightly behind, as if the direction had shifted in a way no one needed to explain, and she did not look back. Not because she was afraid but because she understood that whatever had just happened in that room was not something she could measure by turning around, it was something that would follow her whether she acknowledged it or not. The elevator doors closing with a soft, controlled sound as the descent began, and for the first time since she had stepped into that space above the restaurant floor, she allowed herself a slow breath, her fingers loosening slightly at her sides as the tension eased, though not completely, because the change he had spoken of still sat in her mind, unfamiliar and undefined. And when the doors opened again, the lower level felt different too, the same polished floors, the same dim lighting, but no longer just a place she moved through unnoticed. Now it felt like something she had stepped out of and might step back into differently, her eyes briefly catching her reflection in the glass of a nearby cabinet, and for a moment she paused, not out of vanity but recognition, because she did not look different, not really. The same uniform, the same tired lines at the edge of her posture, but something in her gaze had steadied, as if being seen had not diminished her but clarified something she had always carried quietly, and she turned away before the thought could settle too deeply, returning to where she had left her supplies, the mop still leaning against the wall, the faint scent of cleaner lingering in the air as if nothing had changed at all, and yet everything had shifted in ways that could not be undone. She picked it up slowly, her movements automatic at first, guided by routine, but then she stopped, her hand resting lightly on the handle as she listened, not for sound, but for that quiet rhythm she had carried earlier, and for a brief second she considered letting it go, letting the moment stay where it belonged, upstairs. Contained and separate from the rest of her night, but the thought did not hold, because that was not how she had learned to live. She had never separated what kept her steady from where she stood, and so, without hesitation, she stepped forward again, the motion smaller this time, quieter, but just as real, her foot shifting slightly as her weight followed, not a full dance, not something meant to be seen, just a continuation of something that refused to disappear simply because the world around her had changed, and across the room, unnoticed by most, one of the night staff glanced up briefly, watching her for a second longer than usual before returning to his work, not understanding why the space felt different, only that it did, and above them, far beyond the visible ceiling, Adrian remained where he was, his gaze still turned toward the city, but his thoughts no longer aligned with the rhythm he had walked in with, because the room behind him no longer felt complete in the way it once had, and the quiet he had always relied on now carried a different weight, one that could not be ignored, his hand resting lightly against the glass as if grounding himself in the stillness, though it no longer felt the same, and for the first time in a long time, he did not reach for a phone, did not call for anyone, did not move to the next decision waiting for him, he simply stood there, aware of something he had not built, something he could not control, and the realization did not come with resistance, it came with a quiet certainty that settled deeper with each passing second, because somewhere below, in a space that had always been considered beneath his notice, something had shifted. And he could feel it, not as a disruption, but as a beginning. Morning arrived without ceremony, the soft gray light of early dawn slipping through the tall windows of the restaurant before the city had fully woken, and Lena was already there, earlier than usual, not because she had been told to arrive sooner but because something in her would not let her stay away, her steps quieter now, more aware of the space she was entering as if it no longer belonged entirely to routine, the air still carrying the faint trace of the night before, polished surfaces waiting to be touched again, silence stretching across the room like a canvas that had not yet been disturbed, and for a moment she stood near the entrance, taking it in, not as someone who cleaned it, but as someone who could feel it, her hand brushing lightly along the edge of a table as she walked further inside, her movement slower, not out of hesitation but intention, because she understood now that what she did here could shape something beyond appearance, and upstairs, far above where the first deliveries were just beginning to arrive and the early staff had started their quiet routines, Adrian had not left, the night having folded into morning without interruption, his jacket resting over the back of a chair as he stood near the same window, the city below shifting from darkness to motion, headlights replaced by the steady flow of morning traffic, and yet his focus was not on the streets or the calls that had already begun to line up on his phone, it was on something far less tangible, something that had unsettled the rhythm he had followed for years without question, his gaze moving slowly across the room behind him, seeing it now not as a completed structure but as a space that had never been asked to feel anything, and that realization lingered longer than any decision he had ever made, because it did not come with a clear next step, it came with a question he had never needed to consider, and when the door opened quietly behind him, he did not turn. Immediately, already knowing who it would be before the sound had fully settled, Lena stepped inside with careful composure, her uniform freshly pressed. Her posture steady, though there was a subtle awareness in her movement that had not been there before, as if she understood that this room required more than presence, it required intention, and Adrian finally turned, his gaze meeting hers not as a command but as acknowledgement, the silence between them returning, but it was no longer uncertain, it carried a quiet familiarity. "You came early," he said, his voice low, not questioning, just observing, and Lena nodded slightly, her eyes steady. "I thought the room should not feel empty before anyone arrives," she replied, and the simplicity of her answer settled into the space around them, not as an explanation but as a continuation of something that had already begun. Adrian watched her for a moment longer, something in his expression unreadable yet no longer distant, and without another word, he stepped aside, not as an order, not as permission, but as a gesture that shifted the room itself, allowing her to move forward not as someone entering his space, but as someone shaping it, and Lena walked past him quietly, her steps measured as she reached the center of the room, her hand resting lightly on the back of a chair before she paused, listening again, not for sound, but for that quiet rhythm she carried within her, and this time, when she moved, it was not hidden, not something done in secrecy, it was small, almost imperceptible, but present, her body aligning with something unseen yet deeply felt, and Adrian did not look away, did not interrupt, he simply watched, his stillness no longer about control, but about understanding, and in that quiet morning light, the room changed, not in structure, not in design, but in something far more subtle, something that could not be measured or owned, only felt, and for the first time, it did not feel empty. The first guests arrived just after sunrise had fully settled into the city, their footsteps measured, their voices low and polished as they entered a space that had always promised perfection without ever asking to be felt, but something was different that morning, not obvious, not something that could be pointed out or explained, just a quiet shift in the way the light seemed to settle across the tables, the way the air carried a subtle warmth that had not been there before, and Lena moved through it with steady intention, her hands no longer rushing through motions but guiding them, each adjustment small yet deliberate, aligning the room with something beyond appearance, while Adrian remained near the edge of it all, not hidden, not distant, simply present, watching not as a man who owned the space but as someone learning what it meant to see it, his gaze following the rhythm of her movement, the way she paused before straightening a chair, the way she let her hand linger for a second longer than necessary as if listening for something that could not be heard, and he understood now that it was not about the task, it was about what she carried into it, something he had never considered in a world built entirely on outcomes, and as the room slowly filled, the subtle difference began to ripple outward, a guest pausing for a moment longer than usual before sitting, another glancing around as if trying to understand why the space felt less rigid, less distant, and though no one spoke of it, the change was there, undeniable in the way people settled more easily, in the way conversations began without the usual hesitation, and Lena did not look for acknowledgement, she did not measure the effect, she simply continued, grounded in the quiet rhythm she had always known, and across the room, Adrian finally stepped forward, not with urgency, not with command, but with a calm that carried more weight than any order he had ever given, his presence drawing a subtle stillness as those who recognized him instinctively straightened, but he did not address them, did not shift the room back into the structure they expected, instead he stopped near Lena, his voice low enough that it did not travel beyond the space between them. "You changed it," he said, and the words were not a question, not even a realization, they were an acknowledgement of something he had witnessed but could not claim, and Lena glanced up at him briefly, her expression steady, not surprised, not seeking approval, just present in the moment. "No," she replied softly, "I just did not leave it empty," and that distinction settled deeper than anything else she had said, because it reframed everything he had built, everything he had believed about control and completeness, and for a brief second, Adrian did not respond, not because he had nothing to say, but because the truth of it required no addition, and as he looked around the room once more, seeing it not as a finished product but as something alive, something shaped by presence rather than power, he understood something he had never been forced to confront before, that influence was not always commanded, sometimes it was carried, quietly, consistently, without recognition, and that was something no authority could replicate, and as he stepped back, allowing the room to continue without interruption, the silence that followed was not empty, it was full in a way that could not be measured, and that morning, without announcement, without spectacle, something had shifted in a man who had never needed to change, because for the first time, he had seen what dignity looked like when it did not ask to be noticed, only to be respected.